The sky over Normandy had turned into a killing field, and Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann understood this with the clarity that comes only from watching men die. It was the morning of August 18th, 1944, and his Panzer IV sat motionless beneath the sprawling branches of an apple orchard near Troon, its engine cold, its crew silent. They had learned not to move during daylight. Movement meant death from above. Through the gaps in the foliage, Bergmann could see the contrails, white streaks scratching across the blue August sky like chalk marks on a board, each one representing an American fighter-bomber circling, hunting, waiting. His division, once a proud component of the 7th Army, had been reduced to this, hiding like rabbits, praying the leaves above would be enough to fool the eyes of pilots flying machines that had rewritten every rule of armored warfare Bergmann had ever learned. The question that would haunt German armored commanders for the remainder of the war had already been answered here in the narrow corridors of the Falaise Pocket, though many refused to accept it. What happens when the world's most advanced tank forces meet an enemy that owns the sky completely? The answer lay scattered across the Norman countryside, burned-out Panthers and Tigers, their thick armor no protection against rockets fired from above, their vaunted 88mm guns useless against targets moving at 300 miles per hour. Bergmann had entered this war believing in the supremacy of German armor, in the technical superiority that would compensate for any numerical disadvantage. In the orchards near Troon, surrounded by the wrecks of his comrades' vehicles, he was learning a different lesson entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Ernst Bergmann had been born into the Panzerwaffe as it reached its zenith. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1939, completed his officer training in 1940, and received his first command of Panzer III in time for the invasion of France. That campaign had taught him everything he thought he needed to know about modern warfare. Speed, coordination, the concentrated punch of armor breaking through weak points in enemy lines. These principles had delivered France in 6 weeks. The French had more tanks, more men, even more guns, but they had been paralyzed by German mobility and tactical innovation. Bergmann had crossed the Meuse River, pushed through the Ardennes, and raced toward the Channel coast, watching French and British units crumble before the Wehrmacht's mechanized onslaught. By the time he fought in Russia, he had become a true believer in armored warfare as Germany practiced it. The Eastern Front had complicated that faith but not destroyed it. Soviet tanks came in terrifying numbers. Bergmann had seen entire horizons filled with T-34s, wave after wave of them, their sloped armor and wide tracks better suited to the Russian terrain than anything Germany produced. The Tiger and Panther tanks had been developed specifically to counter the Soviet threat, and they worked. Bergmann had transitioned to a Panzer IV AOSF's H in 1943, and though it lacked the thick armor of the heavier tanks, it possessed something equally valuable: reliability. He had learned to fight outnumbered, to use terrain and tactics to compensate for Soviet numerical superiority. The key was mobility. Keep moving. Strike from unexpected angles. Never let the enemy pin you down. German armored doctrine emphasized the offensive, the breakthrough, the exploitation. A stationary tank was a dead tank, but only because it could be surrounded and overwhelmed by enemy armor or anti-tank guns. The threat always came from the ground. No one had prepared him for a threat from above that could see everything, strike anywhere, and against which there was no effective defense. The transfer to Normandy in June of 1944 had seemed almost like a relief after the brutal attrition of the Eastern Front. France meant shorter supply lines, better roads, the possibility of rest and refit. Bergmann's battalion had been assigned to the 7th Army, part of the forces defending Normandy against the Allied invasion everyone knew was coming. The briefings emphasized that German forces in France were strong, well-equipped, and positioned to throw the invasion back into the sea. Bergmann believed it. He had seen what Panzer divisions could do when properly employed. The Allies would land, establish a beachhead, and then German armor would smash into them before they could consolidate, driving them back into the Channel. It had worked in France in 1940. It would work again. What the briefings had not emphasized, what Bergmann had not fully grasped until he experienced it personally, was the extent of Allied air superiority. He had encountered enemy aircraft in Russia, certainly. Soviet Sturmovix had attacked his positions, and they were dangerous, but they came in limited numbers, and German flak could usually drive them off or shoot them down. In Normandy, the situation was different not merely in degree, but in kind. The Allies did not contest the air, they owned it, completely, absolutely, without exception. Bergmann's battalion had begun its movement toward the invasion beaches on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the landings. They traveled during the day initially, following standard procedure for rapid deployment. Within 3 hours, they had lost 4 tanks to air attack, not to bombs dropped from high-altitude strategic bombers, but to fighter bombers, nimble, fast aircraft that dove from the sky, fired rockets with terrible accuracy, and disappeared before the flak guns could even traverse to engage them. The battalion commander ordered movement restricted to nighttime. They would hide during the day, travel after dark. It cut their mobility in half, turned every advance into an exhausting crawl, but the alternative was annihilation from above. By the time Bergmann reached the front lines near Caen in mid-June, he understood that this campaign would be unlike anything he had experienced. The Allies were not just bombing strategic targets or providing air support to ground forces. They were hunting individual tanks. American pilots, flying aircraft designated P-47 Thunderbolts, would circle over the battlefield for hours, watching, waiting for any German vehicle to move. When it did, they attacked with a ferocity and precision that shocked even veterans of the Eastern Front. Bergmann watched a Tiger tank, 60 tons of steel, armed with the feared 88mm gun, its frontal armor thick enough to stop anything the Allies could fire at it from the ground, get destroyed by 3 P-47s in less than 2 minutes. The aircraft came in from behind, where the Tiger's armor was thinner, fired rockets that punched through the engine deck, and the massive tank simply exploded. 60 tons of Germany's best armor technology, crewed by experienced men, reduced to burning scrap by aircraft that weighed a fraction of what the tank did. The realization came slowly, then all at once. German armored doctrine was obsolete, not flawed, not inadequate, but fundamentally obsolete. Everything Bergmann had learned about tank warfare assumed that the primary threats came from enemy tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery, all ground-based systems that operated on roughly the same plane as the Panzers themselves. You could maneuver against those threats, use terrain, concentrate forces to achieve local superiority. But how did you maneuver against an enemy who could see the entire battlefield from above, who could strike any target within minutes, and who was present continuously from dawn until dusk? The Americans and British flew in shifts, maintaining constant air coverage. There were always fighters overhead, always. Bergmann's training had not addressed this scenario because it had been considered impossible. The Luftwaffe was supposed to contest the skies. German fighters were supposed to prevent enemy aircraft from operating freely over the battlefield. But the Luftwaffe was not there. Oh, German fighters appeared occasionally. Bergmann saw a Focke-Wulf 190 attack an Allied formation once, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. For every German aircraft that appeared, there were dozens of Allied planes. The skies belonged to the Americans and British, and they used that advantage with methodical, devastating efficiency. The battle for Normandy became a grinding stalemate through June and July. German forces fought with their characteristic tactical skill, but they could not maneuver, could not concentrate for counterattacks, could not exploit any breakthrough because Allied aircraft prevented large-scale movement during daylight hours. Bergmann's battalion spent weeks in defensive positions near Caen, watching supplies dwindle, watching replacement tanks fail to arrive because Allied fighters destroyed them en route, watching the noose tighten. His Panzer IV had been hit once. A rocket had struck the turret at an angle, not penetrating but damaging the traverse mechanism. His crew spent 2 days repairing it with scavenged parts while hiding in a barn, working only at night, knowing that if they were spotted, another attack would finish them. By early August, the strategic situation had become critical. American forces had broken out of the Normandy beachhead at Avranches and were racing east and north, threatening to encircle the German forces still fighting near Falaise. Hitler's orders were explicit: hold the line, no retreat. A counterattack was planned to cut off the American breakthrough at Mortagne. Bergmann's division was among the units designated for this operation. When he received the orders, he felt a familiar sensation: excitement mixed with dread. This was what Panzer forces were designed for. The concentrated armored thrust, the bold counterstroke that would shatter enemy plans. But he also knew what such an operation would require: movement in daylight, concentration of forces, exposure to the very air power that had been killing his comrades for 2 months. The Mortagne counterattack began on August 7th. It failed within 48 hours. Allied aircraft swarmed the German formations like wasps around a disturbed nest. P-47 Thunderbolts, British Typhoons equipped with rockets, American medium bombers, all of them converged on the German armor as it attempted to advance. Bergmann's battalion lost 9 tanks in the first day, not to enemy ground forces, but to airstrikes. The survivors pulled back into whatever cover they could find. The counterattack had not just failed, it had accelerated the encirclement. American and Canadian forces were now closing from multiple directions, and the German 7th Army, along with substantial portions of the 5th Panzer Army, found itself trapped in a pocket centered around the town of Falaise. Bergmann received the order to withdraw on August 13th. By then, the pocket was already forming, the Allied pincers closing from north and south. His battalion was to move east through Troon and Chambois, attempting to escape before the gap closed entirely. They would travel at night, hide during the day, and hope to slip through before being surrounded completely. It was a retreat, though no one used that word officially. Bergmann had retreated before, in Russia, falling back from Soviet offensives that came with overwhelming force. But those retreats had been difficult yet organized, with German armor providing rearguard protection, covering each withdrawal. This was different. This was a route in slow motion, a desperate attempt to avoid encirclement by an enemy who could watch every movement from the sky. The column moved out after dark on August 13th. Bergmann's Panzer IV took position in the middle of the formation, surrounded by other tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and artillery pieces. They traveled without lights, navigating by moonlight and memory, keeping to tree lines where possible. The roads were clogged with vehicles and units from multiple divisions, all streaming east toward the shrinking gap. Progress was agonizingly slow. They covered perhaps 15 kilometers that first night before dawn forced them to seek cover. Bergmann found the apple orchard near Troon, pulled his tank beneath the trees, and ordered his crew to camouflage it with branches and netting. Then they waited for darkness to come again. But daylight on August 14th brought something worse than mere visibility. It brought the Jabos, the German slang for Jagdbomber, fighter bombers. Bergmann heard them before he saw them, the distinctive roar of large radial engines growing louder than the whistle of diving aircraft. His crew froze inside the tank, holding their breath as if that might help hide them. Through the vision slit, Bergmann watched a P-47 Thunderbolt dive toward a column of trucks on the road barely 300 meters away. The aircraft was enormous, much larger than he had expected, with a blunt nose and thick wings. It fired its rockets in pairs, bright streaks that arced toward the trucks and detonated with concussive force that Bergmann felt through the ground. 2 trucks exploded instantly. The fighter pulled up, banked, and came around for another pass, this time using its .850 caliber machine guns to strafe the burning vehicles. More Thunderbolts appeared. Within minutes, there were at least a dozen circling overhead, working in pairs, systematically destroying every vehicle they could see. Bergmann watched in helpless rage as a Panzer tank, attempting to flee the road for cover, was struck by 4 rockets simultaneously. The heavy tank stopped, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, and then its ammunition exploded, blowing the turret completely off. It landed 20 meters away. The attack continued for nearly 90 minutes. Bergmann counted 7 separate groups of P-47s, each making multiple passes. They seemed to have unlimited ammunition and fuel. Some would attack, pull away, and return 20 minutes later for another strike. There was no respite, no moment when the sky was clear. When it finally ended, when the last Thunderbolt climbed away toward the west, Bergmann emerged from his tank to assess the damage. The road was impassable, choked with burning vehicles. He counted at least 15 destroyed tanks within sight of his position, along with dozens of trucks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces. Bodies lay scattered among the wreckage. The wounded cried out for medics who could not reach them because moving meant drawing the attention of pilots that might still be overhead. The smell, burning fuel, burning rubber, burning flesh, hung thick in the August heat. His battalion had not been directly attacked. The orchard's concealment had held. But they were now trapped. The road east was blocked. Moving across open country in daylight was suicide. They would have to wait until dark, try to bypass the destruction, and continue the retreat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Except darkness brought no relief. The Allies had anticipated the German tactics, had understood that the Wehrmacht would attempt to move at night. On the evening of August 14th, Bergmann watched in disbelief as Allied aircraft dropped flares over the pocket. Bright magnesium parachutes that turned night into day, illuminating the landscape below for minutes at a time. Under the flares, P-47s continued their attacks, hunting by artificial light. The trap had been perfected. German forces could not move during the day because they would be spotted and destroyed. They could not move at night because the Allies simply illuminated the battlefield and continued attacking. The pocket was shrinking hourly, and there was no way out. By August 16th, Bergmann's position near Troon had become untenable. Allied ground forces were closing from the north and south. Artillery fire was increasing. The gap to the east, through which German forces might escape, had narrowed to perhaps 10 kilometers. His battalion commander ordered another attempt to break through, to be executed the following morning regardless of air attack. There was no choice. Remain and be captured or killed by ground forces, or attempt to run the gauntlet of Allied air power and hope that some would make it through. Bergmann knew what this meant. He had watched the Thunderbolts work for 3 days now. He understood their capabilities, their tactics, their relentlessness. The breakout attempt would be a slaughter. He was correct. But even his darkest expectations fell short of the reality. The morning of August 17th, 1944, arrived with deceptive beauty. Clear skies, mild temperatures, excellent visibility, conditions that would have been welcomed by any military commander in any other circumstance. For Ernst Bergmann and the trapped remnants of the German Seventh Army, that perfect weather was a death sentence. His crew mounted the Panzer IV in silence, each man knowing what lay ahead. They had perhaps 15 kilometers to cover to reach relative safety beyond Chambois, where German lines still held. 15 kilometers across open Norman farmland with nowhere to hide, and an enemy above who could see everything. The breakout began at dawn, before the first Allied fighters appeared. Bergmann's battalion, or what remained of it, 11 tanks instead of the original 42, moved out from the orchard in column formation, following a farm track that paralleled the main road. Speed was essential. They had perhaps 2 hours before the Yabos arrived in force, 2 hours to cover as much ground as possible. The Panzer IV's Maybach engine roared as Bergmann's driver pushed it to maximum speed, nearly 40 kilometers per hour across the rough terrain. Other vehicles joined the column. Half-tracks, trucks, even horse-drawn wagons carrying wounded men. Everyone understood that this was the last chance. They made it 7 kilometers before the Thunderbolts found them. Bergmann was scanning the horizon ahead when his radio operator shouted a warning. He looked up through the cupola and saw them coming from the south. Not a pair or a flight, but a formation that seemed to fill the entire sky. He counted 12 aircraft in the first wave, flying in groups of 4, stacked at different altitudes. They were approaching deliberately, without haste, professional hunters who had located their prey and were now preparing to kill it methodically. His throat constricted. There was nowhere to run. The nearest tree line was 300 meters away across open fields. They would never make it. The lead group of P-47s peeled off and dove. Bergmann had seen this before, but never directed at his own vehicle, never with the certainty that he was the target. The Thunderbolt was massive. He could see that now, with a wingspan wider than his tank was long. It carried rockets under its wings, 8 of them, each tipped with a high explosive warhead designed specifically to penetrate armor. The fighter's nose was painted with teeth, a shark's mouth that seemed to grin as it screamed toward the earth. Bergmann screamed into his radio for the column to scatter, to break formation, to do anything, but it was too late. The first Thunderbolt fired its rockets at a range of perhaps 600 meters. Bright orange streaks leapt from beneath the wings, impossibly fast, arcing toward the column with trails of white smoke. The rockets struck a half-track 2 vehicles ahead of Bergmann's position. The explosions were not the thunderous detonations of heavy bombs, but sharp, focused cracks that punched through armor and killed with precision. The half-track disintegrated. There was no other word for it. One moment it existed, filled with men and equipment, and the next it was simply gone, replaced by a fountain of fire and debris that rained down across the track. The Thunderbolt pulled up, banking away, and Bergmann caught a glimpse of the pilot's face behind the canopy glass. Just a glimpse, but enough to see that he was young, focused, professional. This was not terror bombing or random destruction. This was skilled, calculated hunting. 3 more Thunderbolts dove on the column. Bergmann ordered his driver to turn hard left, to get off the track and into the open field where they might at least maneuver. The Panzer IV responded, sluggishly. Its suspension was designed for roads, not cross-country speed, but they managed to break away from the column's formation. Behind them, rockets slammed into a Panzer III, striking it in the side. The smaller tank shuddered under the impact, kept rolling for perhaps 50 meters, then ground to a halt as smoke poured from its hatches. Bergman watched the crew bail out, running for a nearby ditch. 2 of them made it. The third was caught by machine gun fire from a Thunderbolt's strafing run, 50 caliber bullets that chewed up the ground and the man with equal indifference. The Panzer force lurched across the field, engine screaming. Bergman's gunner traversed the turret, searching for a target. But what could a tank gun do against an aircraft moving 300 miles per hour? The 88mm guns on Tigers and Panthers could fire at aircraft using special sights, but the Panzer IV's shorter 75mm gun lacked even that theoretical capability. They were helpless. Bergman felt rage and terror competing in his chest, rage at the unfairness of it, at being reduced to prey, and terror because he knew with absolute clarity that his tactical skill, his experience, his training, all of it meant nothing against this kind of attack. More Thunderbolts appeared. Bergman lost count after the first wave. They seemed endless, arriving in groups of 4 or 6, each group making multiple passes before withdrawing to let fresh aircraft take their place. The Americans were rotating their attacks, maintaining constant pressure, never allowing the German column a moment to regroup or escape. Bergman realized he was witnessing something new in warfare, not just air superiority, but air dominance, weaponized into a system of systematic annihilation. These pilots were not simply supporting ground forces or attacking strategic targets. They were destroying an entire army formation vehicle by vehicle, tank by tank, man by man. His Panzer force reached a small depression, a fold in the ground that offered perhaps a meter of defilade. Bergman ordered a halt, hoping the slight cover might make them less visible. Through his vision slit, he watched the destruction of his battalion unfold across the field behind him. A Panther tank, attempting to flee toward a distant tree line, was struck by multiple rockets simultaneously. The heavy tank, 45 tons of steel representing hundreds of hours of German industrial effort, simply exploded. Its ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion so violent that the turret was thrown through the air like a child's toy. Another Panzer force, identical to Bergman's own vehicle, tried to hide behind a burning truck. A Thunderbolt saw it anyway, dove, fired, and the tank erupted in flames. Bergman could hear the crew screaming over the radio, cut off as their transmission ended abruptly. The attacks continued without pause. 30 minutes, 45, an hour, the Thunderbolts worked. With methodical efficiency, dividing the killing ground into sectors, ensuring no vehicle escaped. Bergman saw aircraft returning for second and third passes, having rearmed somewhere nearby. The Americans had established forward airfields so close to the front that their fighters could attack, reload, and return within 20 minutes. The implications of this were staggering. Germany could barely keep its existing airfields operational, could barely maintain fuel supplies for its diminishing fighter force. The Americans had so many aircraft, so much fuel, so much ammunition, that they could maintain this level of attack indefinitely. A Thunderbolt spotted Bergman's position in the depression. He saw it bank, adjust its course, begin its dive. This was the end, then. He had survived France in 1940, survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, survived the battles in Normandy, and now he would die in a Norman field under the guns of an American pilot he would never meet. There was something absurd about it, something that made him want to laugh even as his hands gripped the cupola rim hard enough to hurt. The Thunderbolt came on, growing larger, its rockets clearly visible under the wings. Then a different sound penetrated the chaos. German 88mm flak guns firing from somewhere to the east. Bergman saw the black puffs of exploding shells appear near the diving Thunderbolt. The pilot broke off his attack, pulled up sharply, and banked away. The flak battery fired again, bracketing another P-47 that was lining up for a strafing run. The Americans pulled back, climbing to higher altitude, reassessing. For perhaps 5 minutes the attack paused. Bergmann used those minutes to get his tank moving again, racing across the field toward the sound of the German guns. Other survivors did the same. Scattered vehicles converging on the flak position like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The flak battery consisted of 4 88mm guns positioned on a low ridge, manned by Luftwaffe ground crews who were firing with desperate intensity. Their presence forced the Thunderbolts to attack from higher altitude or at steeper angles, reducing their accuracy. It was not safety. Nothing could provide that, but it was better than being completely defenseless. Bergmann reached the ridge and positioned his tank in a small quarry nearby, finally achieving some degree of cover. He climbed out of the cupola to assess the situation. What he saw made his heart sink. Of the 11 tanks that had begun the breakout that morning, he could see only 4 survivors gathered near the flak position. 4. The others were scattered across the killing field behind them, burning, exploded, or simply stopped with their crews dead inside. The trucks and half-tracks had fared even worse. Bergmann estimated that perhaps 1 in 5 vehicles had survived the first hour of the attack, and the Thunderbolts were still there circling, waiting for an opportunity to resume their work. A young Luftwaffe officer approached Bergmann, shouting over the roar of the flak guns. "We cannot protect you for long. We have perhaps 20 more shells per gun. Then we are out of ammunition." Bergmann nodded, understanding. The flak battery had already used most of its ammunition in the initial defense. Once the guns fell silent, the Thunderbolts would return in force. They had perhaps 30 minutes to decide whether to continue the breakout attempt or surrender. The decision was made for them. More Allied aircraft appeared from the west. Not Thunderbolts this time, but British Typhoons, recognizable by their distinctive profile, and the rockets mounted under their wings. The Typhoon was, if anything, even more feared than the P-47. German soldiers called it the Jabberschreck, the terror fighter bomber. The new wave of aircraft began their attacks immediately, diving on the flak position. The Luftwaffe guns engaged, firing as fast as their crews could load and aim, but there were too many targets. A Typhoon's rockets struck one of the 88mm guns, the explosion killing most of the crew instantly. Another gun was disabled by machine gun fire that shredded its shield and wounded the gunner. Bergmann ran back to his tank, ordering his crew to start the engine. They could not stay here. The flak protection was collapsing. He looked east, toward where German lines supposedly held, and saw only more open ground, more killing zones. He looked at his crew. His driver, Franz, who had been with him since 1942, his gunner, Klaus, a veteran of Kursk, his loader and radio operator, both young men barely 20 years old. They looked at him with expressions that combined fear, exhaustion, and a terrible resignation. They knew what he knew. There was no escape. Not from this. Not from enemies who owned the sky so completely that they could hover overhead for hours, picking off targets at leisure. "We hide," Bergmann said finally. "We find cover, we camouflage the tank, and we wait for darkness. It is the only chance." Klaus nodded slowly. The others said nothing, but they obeyed. The Panzer force moved deeper into the quarry, backing against the rock wall. The crew used branches and their camouflage netting to conceal the vehicle as best they could. Then they waited, listening to the sounds of battle continuing across the pocket. Explosions, aircraft engines, the occasional crack of tank guns firing at hopeless range at aircraft they could not hit. The attacks continued throughout August 17th and into the 18th. Bergman lost track of the number of aircraft he saw. Dozens, certainly, perhaps more than 100. They came in waves, perfectly coordinated, each group attacking a different sector of the pocket. He watched Thunderbolts destroy a column of vehicles attempting to escape toward Chambois, watched them work for 90 minutes, systematically, destroying every vehicle in the column until nothing remained but burning wreckage. He counted 72 destroyed tanks in that single engagement, their hulls scattered across 3 kilometers of Norman countryside. 72 tanks, nearly 2 full battalions, killed not by enemy armor or anti-tank guns, but by aircraft that most German doctrine had considered a secondary threat. The realization that had been building in Bergman's mind for weeks crystallized into absolute certainty during those hours in the quarry. Germany had lost the war. Not strategically, that might have been evident to the High Command for some time, but tactically, fundamentally, at the level where warfare was actually conducted. The Allies possessed capabilities that Germany could not counter. They had so many aircraft, so much fuel, so much ammunition, that they could maintain attacks like this across multiple sectors simultaneously. They could see everything from above, strike anything that moved, and do so with precision that turned individual vehicles into targets. German armor, even the vaunted Tigers and Panthers, meant nothing against this level of air supremacy. You could not hide from eyes in the sky. You could not maneuver when movement brought instant death from above. You could not concentrate forces for counterattacks when the concentration itself became a target. And the most crushing aspect of all, this was just one pocket, one sector of one front. If the Americans and British could deploy this much air power here, what were they doing elsewhere? How many more German formations were being destroyed the same way at this very moment? The industrial disparity was not just about numbers, though the numbers were staggering, but about the ability to employ those numbers with systematic, overwhelming effect. The Americans had built not just aircraft, but an entire system of airborne destruction. Forward airfields, rapid rearming, trained pilots, coordination with ground forces, all of it working together with machine-like efficiency. Bergman had fought the Russians, had seen their masses of tanks and men, had learned to respect Soviet determination and increasingly effective tactics. But the Russians did not own the sky. They could be outmaneuvered, outfought by superior German tactical skill even when outnumbered. The Americans and British had removed that possibility entirely. They had found a way to render German tactical skill irrelevant by attacking from a dimension that German doctrine barely addressed. Armor was useless when aircraft destroyed it, before it could engage. Infantry was helpless when fighters strafed concentrations with machine guns. Artillery could not fire when the crews were killed by rockets before they could deploy. The entire German way of war, developed over decades and proven in Poland, France, and Russia, had been made obsolete by an enemy that had learned to fight differently. On the night of August 18th, under cover of darkness and using every bit of concealment they could manage, Bergman and his crew abandoned their Panzer IV and fled east on foot. They left the tank intact. There was no time to destroy it, and the explosion would have drawn attention. They simply walked away from it, leaving behind the vehicle that had been Bergman's command, his weapon, his identity as a Panzer officer. They walked through fields strewn with destroyed equipment, past burning vehicles still smoldering from the day's attacks, past bodies of soldiers who had not made it this far. They crossed the shrinking gap near Chambois just before dawn, joining other survivors streaming toward German lines in groups of 10 or 20, all that remained of divisions that had numbered in the thousands. Of Bergman's original battalion of 42 tanks, 3 made it out of the Falaise Pocket. 3. The rest lay scattered across the Norman countryside, destroyed by aircraft that had hunted them with methodical precision. Of those 3 survivors, only one was still operational. The others had been abandoned when they ran out of fuel or suffered mechanical breakdowns. Bergmann never saw his Panzer IV again, never learned what happened to it. Perhaps the Allies recovered it, studied it, added it to some intelligence assessment of German capabilities. Perhaps it was simply scrapped. It did not matter. The tank had become irrelevant the moment Allied air supremacy had been established over Normandy. In the weeks that followed, as Bergmann retreated across France with the remnants of his unit, he learned the full extent of the disaster at Falaise. The pocket had contained approximately 100,000 German troops. Perhaps 20,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. More critically, the trapped forces had lost nearly all their heavy equipment. Estimates varied, but post-war analysis suggested that between 500 and 700 tanks and assault guns had been destroyed in and around the Falaise Pocket, along with thousands of other vehicles. A substantial portion of that destruction, perhaps half, came not from ground combat, but from air attacks by Allied fighter bombers, primarily American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons. The numbers were staggering, but they told only part of the story. The psychological impact was equally devastating. German soldiers who survived Falaise returned to their units with stories that seemed almost impossible to believe. Aircraft that could see individual tanks from kilometers away, rockets that could penetrate the thickest armor, attacks that continued for hours without pause, pilots rotating in and out while German forces could only hide and pray. These stories spread through the Wehrmacht, carried by survivors who had witnessed the Allies' air supremacy firsthand. Tank crews who had once felt confident in their armor's protection now understood that the greatest threat came not from enemy tanks but from the sky. The Falaise Pocket became shorthand for a particular kind of helplessness, being trapped under Allied air power with no defense and no escape. Ernst Bergmann survived the war. He was captured in April of 1945 during the final Allied drive into Germany, and spent 2 years in a British POW camp before being released in 1947. In interviews conducted decades later, he remained reluctant to discuss his experiences in detail, but when pressed about Falaise, his response was stark. "We were not defeated in battle. We were slaughtered from above. There is a difference. In battle, you can fight back, you can maneuver, you can at least die trying to kill your enemy. At Falaise, we could only hide and hope they did not see us. That is not warfare, that is butchery." The Falaise Pocket represented a watershed in military history, though its lessons were not immediately understood. Air power advocates had long argued that aircraft could win wars independently of ground forces. Falaise seemed to prove them right, but the reality was more complex. The Thunderbolts and Typhoons were devastatingly effective because they operated as part of an integrated system that included ground forces, intelligence, logistics, and industrial production. The Americans did not simply build aircraft. They built an entire apparatus for employing air power systematically. Forward airfields allowed quick turnaround times. Efficient logistics kept those aircraft supplied with fuel and ammunition. Trained pilots and ground crews maintained high operational rates. Coordination with ground forces ensured that air attacks supported the overall campaign plan. Germany could not replicate this system even if it had possessed the aircraft, which by 1944 it did not. The Luftwaffe had been bled white over Russia and in the defense of the Reich against Allied strategic bombing. The fighters that remained were mostly dedicated to defending German cities from American and British bombers. Few were available for ground support on the Western Front, and even those few faced impossible odds against the numerical superiority the Allies enjoyed. A German fighter appearing over Normandy might shoot down an Allied bomber or fighter, but it would be immediately swarmed by other Allied aircraft. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Germany was producing perhaps 500 single-engine fighters per month in mid-1944. The Americans alone were producing more than 2,000 per month, not counting British production. The disparity in trained pilots was even worse. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft that had terrorized Bergmann and thousands of other German soldiers at Falaise, was in many ways emblematic of American industrial and military power. It was not the most elegant fighter aircraft ever built. The British Spitfire was more graceful. The German Focke-Wulf 190 was more aerodynamically refined. But the Thunderbolt was rugged, reliable, powerful, and produced in quantities that German planners found difficult to comprehend. More than 15,000 were built during the war. They could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Their 8 50 caliber machine guns and ability to carry rockets and bombs made them devastating ground attack platforms, and they were available in such numbers that losses could be replaced almost immediately. American pilots flying Thunderbolts over Normandy described their work in matter-of-fact terms that would have seemed surreal to German commanders. They spoke of hunting German tanks as if on a safari, circling over the battlefield until they spotted movement, then diving to attack. They compared notes on the most effective ways to destroy different types of German armor, where to aim on a Tiger to ensure a kill, how to attack Panthers to exploit their thinner side armor. Some pilots kept tallies of their confirmed kills, competing with each other for the highest scores. One pilot, Captain Robert H. Johnson, claimed 27 destroyed or damaged tanks in a single mission over the Falaise Pocket on August 18, 1944, the same day Bergmann was hiding in the quarry near Troon. Whether that specific claim was accurate or not, the fact that such claims seemed plausible indicated how target-rich the environment had become for Allied pilots. The destruction inflicted by the P-47s at Falaise was not unique. Similar scenes played out across France in August and September of 1944, as German forces attempted to retreat toward the German border. The same pattern repeated. German columns moving during daylight or even at night under flares, Allied aircraft swarming overhead, systematic destruction of vehicles and equipment. The roads east from Normandy became known as killing grounds, or death alleys. Kilometers of highway lined with destroyed vehicles, burned-out tanks, and abandoned equipment. Some sections had wrecks so densely packed that the roads became impassable, forcing subsequent retreating units to detour cross-country where they became even more vulnerable to air attack. For German tank crews, the experience of being hunted from the air produced psychological effects that persisted long after specific engagements ended. Tank commanders became obsessed with concealment, spending hours camouflaging their vehicles, even when tactical situations demanded rapid movement. Crews refused to move during daylight even when ordered, preferring to face court-martial rather than almost certain death from air attack. Some units reported psychological breakdowns among experienced crews who simply could not cope with the helplessness of being attacked by an enemy they could not fight. The confident, aggressive Panzer spirit that had carried German armor across Europe in 1940 and 1941 had been beaten out of surviving crews by the relentless pressure of Allied air superiority. The material cost of Falaise and similar air attacks on German armor was staggering, but the strategic implications went even deeper. Germany's ability to conduct mobile warfare, the foundation of its military doctrine, depended on being able to concentrate armor at decisive points and maneuver those forces to exploit breakthroughs. Allied air supremacy made this impossible on the Western Front. Any concentration of German armor became a target for immediate air attack. Any movement larger than a few vehicles drew Allied fighters within minutes. The Germans were forced into a defensive posture that negated all the advantages their armor and training should have provided. Panthers and Tigers, technically superior to most Allied tanks in direct combat, were reduced to pillboxes, hiding in buildings or tree lines, unable to maneuver without being destroyed from above. The Americans understood what they had achieved, though the full implications took time to process. Post-war analysis of the Normandy campaign emphasized the critical role of air superiority in enabling the Allied victory. Without the ability to strike German forces at will from the air, the breakout from the Normandy beachhead might have been far more difficult, perhaps even impossible. German armor, if allowed to maneuver freely, remained a formidable force. But Allied air power had found a way to neutralize that threat by attacking it before it could engage Allied ground forces. The Thunderbolts and Typhoons became, in effect, long-range anti-tank weapons that could be deployed anywhere within their operational radius within minutes. This realization would shape military doctrine for decades. The importance of air superiority became axiomatic in American and British military planning. No ground operation would be attempted without first establishing control of the airspace above it. The aircraft carrier, which could project air power across vast distances, became the centerpiece of American naval strategy. The Soviet Union, watching from the east, learned similar lessons and invested heavily in air defense systems and tactical aviation. The era of tank warfare as Germany had practiced it, fast-moving, concentrated armored thrusts supported by artillery and infantry, had ended at Falaise, replaced by a new paradigm where control of the air was prerequisite to effective ground operations. For Ernst Bergmann, sitting in the British POW camp in 1946, these strategic considerations were abstract compared to the immediate visceral memory of helplessness. He remembered the sound of Thunderbolt engines, the whistle of diving aircraft, the crack of rockets exploding against armor. He remembered watching his battalion destroyed by enemies he could not fight, watching friends die in vehicles that were supposed to protect them. Most of all, he remembered the realization that had come to him in the quarry near Troon, that German armor, despite its technical excellence and tactical sophistication, had been rendered obsolete by an enemy who had learned to fight from a dimension Germany could not effectively contest. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the effectiveness of tactical air power, questioning specific claims and analyzing whether strategic bombing or ground forces had been more decisive in defeating Germany. These debates missed the point that Bergmann and other Falaise survivors understood viscerally. It did not matter whether the Thunderbolts killed precisely 72 tanks or 50 or 100 in any given engagement. What mattered was that they could kill any tank, anywhere, anytime they chose, and German forces had no effective counter. That capability alone had changed the fundamental nature of armored warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt would be retired from frontline American service in the early 1950s, replaced by jet aircraft that could fly faster and higher. Many were sold to other nations or scrapped. A few survive in museums, gleaming restored aircraft that visitors admire for their size and power. None of those visitors, looking at a Thunderbolt sitting quietly in a hangar, can fully grasp what it meant to see dozens of them circling overhead, hunting, unstoppable, patient. Ernst Bergmann could have told them, but he rarely did. Some experiences resist translation into words. The Norman countryside where Bergmann hid in his orchard and quarry is peaceful farmland again, the evidence of battle long since cleared away or buried. Tourists visit the memorial at Chambois, reading about the encirclement and destruction of German forces in August of 1944. The numbers are presented: casualties, prisoners, destroyed equipment. But numbers cannot convey the experience of being trapped under skies controlled absolutely by the enemy, of watching one's comrades die without being able to fight back, of understanding with terrible clarity that the war is lost not because the enemy is more skillful, but because he possesses capabilities that render your own skills irrelevant. That was the true lesson of Falaise, the truth that Bergman learned in 90 minutes of terror while American Thunderbolts destroyed 72 tanks. Not that air power was decisive, though it was, but that modern warfare had entered a new phase where dominance in one domain could negate all advantages in another. German armor had been the finest in the world by many measures, crewed by experienced veterans, supported by sophisticated doctrine and training. None of it mattered when the enemy owned the sky. The age of the tank as the dominant weapon of mobile warfare had not ended. Tanks would remain crucial in conflicts for decades, but the age of unchallenged tank operations, of armored forces maneuvering without fear of interdiction from above, had concluded in the fields and lanes around Falaise in August of 1944. Ernst Bergman died in 1993, having lived a quiet life in post-war Germany, working as an engineer, raising a family, rarely discussing his experiences. In one of his last interviews, asked what lesson he had learned from the war, he paused for a long time before answering. "I learned that courage and skill are not enough. I learned that the best training and the finest equipment can be rendered useless by an enemy who fights in a way you are not prepared for. And I learned that the sound of aircraft engines can haunt you for 50 years. The Thunderbolts are gone now. The pilots who flew them mostly past, the battles they fought fading into history. But the transformation they represented, the shift from ground-centric to multi-domain warfare, from armor supremacy to air-ground integration, remains fundamental to how modern militaries operate. Every time a ground force commander today requests air support, every time a pilot strikes a target identified by troops below, every time armies train to fight under conditions where air superiority is assumed, they are implementing lessons learned in places like Falaise. The 90 minutes that destroyed 72 tanks echoed forward through military history, changing how wars are fought and won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.